The Return of the Indian by Lynne Reid Banks. Chapter 13. A Death and a Healing. "Kitsa!" Omri screamed out her name. Startled, she turned her head. Both boys were pelting toward her. Furious at the interruption, she turned back with one quick wiggle of her hips. She pounced. At almost the same second, Patrick reached her. Without time to think, he kicked her, or rather kicked at her. She started to jump away at the same second, so that his foot, though it did just about connect with her, merely accelerated her flight through the air. With a yowl of outrage, empty-mouthed and thwarted, she fled. Omri and Patrick fell to their knees on the spot Kitsa had so hastily vacated. The white horse was lying on its side. Its legs were moving, but it was obviously hurt. It kept raising its head and whinnying, and then letting its head drop back again. Boone was lying half under it. He didn't move. Patrick gently shifted the pony until he could lift Boone clear. Suddenly, Boone shot to his feet and shouted, "Am I dead? Did it kill me?" You look okay to me," said Patrick. His voice sounded to Omri like the voice of a complete stranger. It was deep and gruff like a man's. Boone was looking around in a daze. "What was it?" "A cat." "A cat? It was the biggest dang critter I ever seen in my entire life. It just came from nowhere. One minute I was riding along minding my own business, and suddenly..." His eyes fell on the horse. It raised its head again and whickered softly as if asking him to help it. There was a terrible moment of silence. Boone crouched by the horse's head, stroking it, running his hands over it. He unbuckled the saddle and lifted it clear, and very gently ran his hands over its white side. Then he took off his hat. It was a strange gesture. Omri had seen men do it in films when they heard of someone's death. A gesture of respect, of something stronger than respect. Boone stood up. "Ribs is broke," he said. "Have to finish him." "Oh, no!" Omri heard himself say in a desperate voice. "Ain't no use keeping him alive to suffer. He's my pal." His voice, which cracked and dissolved into tears at the least thing, was now perfectly steady. Slowly he reached for his revolver. Omri couldn't bear it. "Please, Boone, don't! Surely we can save him." Boone shook his head. "He's too far gone. I gotta do it." He looked up again, his face strained but dry-eyed. "You boys turn your back. This ain't for kids to see." Omri turned his back. Patrick didn't. Boone bent down. He whispered something briefly into the horse's ear. Then he put his revolver to its head. Omri didn't see this, but he heard the shot. Tears spilled from his eyes. He couldn't check them. He wiped them hard and furiously with both hands. Why should he, who hardly ever cried anymore, cry over the death of Boone's horse, when Boone, who cried all the time, was so controlled? Turning around, seeing Boone standing quietly beside the horse's body with his hat in one hand and his smoking revolver in the other, Omri tried to feel ashamed of his own weakness, but he couldn't. It was his fault, partly, that this disaster had happened. They had been so preoccupied with the plan and the exciting prospect of bringing more little people to life that they had let Boone ride off into a monstrous wilderness full of deadly dangers. That it should have been Omri's own beloved little cat who had done this just made everything worse. Irrational fear seized him. He crouched down. "I'll kill her," he ground out between his teeth. Boone looked up at him. "Don't you kill nothing, kid. The critter was only following its instincts. You can't blame a cat for being a cat, even if it do fall on a fella as fierce and sudden as a Texas hurricane." We'll get you another horse." "Yeah, you do that. I'll get to be pals with it, same as I was with this'n. Someday, I guess. A man ain't whole without a horse." He replaced his gun in its holster. "Just now, can I have a shovel?" Patrick swallowed, cleared his throat, and said, "We'll bury him for you, Boone." "Thanks, son. I'd be obliged to you." Omri fetched a trowel from the greenhouse and dug a small hole in the flower bed just under a nodding chrysanthemum. Boone took the bridle of the horse and laid the saddle over his arm. Then Patrick picked up the body. It was still warm, and strangely heavy for its size. He laid it in the hole, and Omri covered it, and made a little mound. They stood for a moment. Then Boone settled his hat back on his ginger head. "Come on, then," he said. "We must be getting back to the others before something happens to them." Patrick carried the cowboy back through the rhododendrons. There was no sign of Little Bear and Bright Stars, and for a moment Omri's heart seemed to leap into his mouth. But then Little Bear actually walked, though slowly and unsteadily, out of the ruined longhouse. "Where you go? Why leave?" he demanded. Patrick stooped and opened his hands so Boone could step out onto the seed tray. As far as Omri could judge, the cowboy looked as always, but Little Bear seemed to know at once that something had happened. He even guessed what. "Where horse?" he asked Boone. "Dead," Boone answered shortly. No more was said, but the Indian touched Boone briefly on the shoulder before turning back to Omri. "Now we put braves in box." But this time it was Patrick who had been doing some thinking. "Just a minute, Little Bear." Little Bear turned to him. "What minute? Do now." "Okay, so say we bring 40 Indians to life, then what? I mean, what will happen right away? Because you can't go back and start fighting the French right away." "I go right away. Why not?" "Because you're not well enough. No, Little Bear, you can't be. So we'll have 40 other people on our hands. We'll have to feed them and look after them until you're ready. That might be weeks. That might be days, weeks." "Who weak? I strong." 7 days, said Patrick, holding up 7 fingers. "That's a week," Little Bear glowered. "No week, no wait. If stay here, not help tribe. They make new chief." "I tell you what," said Patrick. He reached into his pocket. "We'll get Matron back. See what she says. Matron?" "Yes." Patrick held up the formidable little figure in her tall cap. Little Bear made a face. "What use white woman with face like old beaver?" "She saved your life, so you'd better not be rude. She's like a doctor." Little Bear looked shocked. "No woman doctor!" he exclaimed. "Well, this one is. She took the metal out of your back last night. If she says you've healed enough to fight, okay. We'll get started on your army. If not, we'll wait." He put Matron in the cupboard. When he opened the door, she was standing, blinking in the sudden sunlight. She had a newly starched cap perched on her head. "Aha!" she said when she saw the boys. "I thought as much. The more I thought about it, the more certain I was that you'd need me again. So, do you know what I did? I popped a few things into my apron pocket just in case." She hitched up her skirt and climbed over the rim of the cupboard. "Think ahead," she said. "That's my motto." Then she saw Little Bear standing before her with folded arms, and uttered a shriek, but not of terror. "What on earth are you doing out of bed? Are you trying to kill yourself?" "Not kill self," said Little Bear calmly. "Maybe kill you." She bore down upon him. "Nonsense, my good man. You're delirious, and no wonder. This is absolutely outrageous. 24 hours after major surgery, and here you are, on your feet instead of flat on your back. I mean, on your front. Lie down at once!" To the amazement of the boys, and no less perhaps to Little Bear's own surprise, he found himself obeying her commands. Clearly it never occurred to her that he wouldn't. He lay down on the pile of leaves, and she knelt to examine him. Bright Stars ran to help her. Together they took off the dressings. Matron peered closely at the wounds, then sat back on her heels. "Unbelievable," she said. "Fantastic. If I didn't see it, I would never credit it. Beautiful, you know." She went and took a tiny bottle of some cotton from her capacious pocket. "The trouble is, we live an entirely unnatural and unhealthful life. Eat the wrong foods, don't exercise enough. Look at this man. Just look. Superb specimen. Not an ounce of fat on him. Bright eyes, perfect teeth, skin and hair gleaming, with health splendid. And if something does go wrong, his magnificent, well-oiled defense system springs into action, and hey presto, he's practically healed." She washed the wounds, and then took out a hypodermic needle and squirted it briefly at the sky. "Just to be on the safe side," she said. "Trousers down." And before Little Bear could grasp her intention, she had pulled his buckskins down and plunged the needle into his bottom. Little Bear had borne a lot of pain without a flinch, but this humiliation was too much. He let out a roar as if he'd been gored by a buffalo. "What a silly fuss! There, all over," said Matron brightly, withdrawing the needle and rubbing the spot briskly with the cotton. "Just in case of infection, but really there's little fear of that. He's practically as good as new. What a constitution, of course," she added modestly. "I didn't do a bad job on him, if I do say so myself." "Would you think he's well enough to go back to do something pretty active?" Omri asked. "Try stopping him," said Matron. She rose to her feet and dusted the earth off her knees. "Personally, if he were in my ward, I'd say bed rest for another day or so, but a body like his knows its own business best." "Could he say, ride?" "That's up to the horse," quipped Matron, laughing rather hoarsely herself. "Well, I must be off." Meanwhile, Little Bear, who had scrambled hastily to his feet, now drew his knife and threatened her with it. But Matron, not at all alarmed, waggled her finger at him. "Tisk, tisk, naughty man! That would never do at St. Thomas's." She turned her back on him. Without a qualm, baffled, he lowered the knife. "Astonishing, these primitives," she remarked to Omri as she strode back to the cupboard. "Perfect control over the body, none at all over the emotions." Back in the cupboard, she offered Omri her hand, and then burst out laughing again. "Ho, ho, ho, ho! Aren't I silly? How could we shake hands? Oh, but do try. I'd just love to shake hands with Giant, even if it is all a very convincing dream." Omri took her tiny hand between his finger and thumb and solemnly shook it. "Cheerio! Do call me in any future hour of need." "We will," said Omri, closing the door. He turned from the cabinet to find Little Bear's eyes fixed on him. "Old white she-bear say I good," he said. "Now, Patrick, Omri, keep word." The boys looked at each other. "Right," said Omri, taking a deep breath. "Let's get started." And that's the end of Chapter 13.